we'll talk about, what I'll talk about today is present day book. Actually, I have an actual copy of which does not touch upon environment. I just want to have a little side note on them, because that is yet another thing that I'm just, this is a book in the flash, which is really exciting. Because it makes it real. Until it's a PDF, it's not really real, yes. And the environment part is new on the new take, and I will not talk about that today unless people ask questions and want to hear me really mumble and rant, like rumble, I guess that's the word. So this project was my post-tenure project, which I was very excited to dive into in fall of 2019, and well, life took a little bit of a different direction. So I was so excited to be on fieldwork in the Netherlands, and talk a little bit about that. And then to spend time in Singapore, traveling to Jakarta regularly to check out the archives and libraries in Indonesia. And that second part didn't happen because Singapore went into lockdown very early on, and international travel was discouraged as of early February, pretty much. So it took me a long time to actually go back to Jakarta and go through the archives and the periodicals that were stored there. And I say that because what I thought I was going to find in the archives, and when I say archive, I'm really here talking primarily about vernacular magazines and women's magazines, and I'll talk more about the sources, but there was definitely a mismatch between what I was hoping to find and what I found. And I constantly thought that it must have been because I wasn't looking hard enough, and I was forgetting about some repositories of sources. And then actually I had to come to the conclusion that no, it was just that some things were not talked about in the way in which I was expecting them. And the reason why I put this forward as almost as a reminder to self and to fellow researchers, especially at the more maybe junior stage, that sometimes you have to adjust your questions. You have to really have this dialogic relationship with your sources, and also ask yourself why you expect to find certain things and why you're not finding them, and whether you're reading things, quote unquote, in the right way, or you're using your own lenses. So with that set aside, I will dive into this and say that this, that domestic nationalism, I'm going to say that this may be just yet another attempt at delving in a very, I'm going to say, probably maybe sometimes an old scholarly question of what is modernity? What is a modern, what makes a nation, whether the people or a state, modern? How do people imagine it? And it's not moving. Okay. And for me, it's an ongoing question through my scholarship, but I've tackled it, but this project was also new in many ways. This is the project that Sydney was referring to. This was my doctoral research that then turned into a book in 2012 that focused on really the idea and practice of an Islamic state in West Java in the very late colonial and revolutionary period, led by Krusten, who was a nationalist Islamist. And some people take issues with putting those two things together, but I think that actually that's what he was. And he went on with his anti-Republican stand. He had an alternative vision to Sukarno, and his rebellion, because that's how it was labeled, was quashed. Eventually in the mid-60s, he was arrested and executed. And so, but to me, this was one way to think about the question of modernity, right? How was Krusten imagining putting Islam at the foundation of a post-colonial non-colonial, anti-colonial, and post-colonial nation. What would that look like? What would that mean? And so it was very much focused on him, very much focused on political debates between him and many others, including Sukarno. And this was another project that I've dealt with in articles form, rather it never became a book. I thought that what became domestic nationalism would be more drawing more from my interest in the influence of post-Ottoman Turkey and Kemalism. So the reforms that Mustafa Kemal Atatürk brought on in the second half of the 1920s and their impact on Indonesia. And that's Sukarno wrote extensively about this and how he thought that Atatürk had kind of cracked the nut of returning Islam to society through a secular state that would not limit Muslims' expressions, but would also not be a caliphate and would not be a sultanate. It would not have a government place for Islam. And Kartasubiryo and Sukarno had quite some debates over this. But again, so to me, this was interesting. This is another way to think about the modern nation state is we cannot embrace one religion. We need to put religion back into society, quote unquote, or keep it into society and make sure that politics is disengaged from people's piety. A third way to think about this, which was also something that Sydney was referring to, is this idea of pluralism, right? Religious pluralism in Indonesia, which came from the Pancasila. And so kind of as almost, I don't want to say an adjustment, but kind of a way of framing secularism in Indonesia, which maybe is better referred to as non-confessionalism, when you have a certain number of religious beliefs that are officially recognized and accepted, and thinking about religious pluralism. My work was primarily on Shia Muslims, and I would say that maybe that project of the modern post-colonial Indonesian nation state based on pluralism definitely failed some people, some religious groups that are not seen as being part of that spectrum of acceptability. So I also got a little fed up with myself at some point that I realized that I was thinking primarily through the lens of politics with a capital P, right? So parliamentary debate, politicians, parties, national frameworks. And on this spectrum, women's voices were not represented at all. I have a secret, not so secret, I mentioned this a couple of times, but kind of resentment towards people who surrounded me when I was a grad student, who didn't ask me, what about Kartasubiryo's wife? Where were all the women? Kartasubiryo's wife is mentioned, I think, once in my book as the wife of Sekarmaji Kartasubiryo, but as the leader of the women's branch of Sarekat Islam in Garut. But I was never prodded to think about, and maybe I should have thought about it myself, fair enough, but maybe somebody should have also prodded me to think about what was their role? What were they doing? And so this was a self-reflection of realizing that my choice of thinking in terms of intellectual history, political history, focusing on Islam, but also focusing really on the political and intellectual aspect was skewing me towards male voices. And so in my post-tenure relaxation of all my muscles and thinking, okay, now I can go on a limb and think about things differently. Let's just go into the archives and see what women were saying about this. And I really did not want to have to deal with the Hague National Archives that are impenetrable, and I'd spent too much time in those rooms, and I was like, okay, I'm really going to rethink how I think about historical inquiry. And so I went to Leiden, which I found it much more pleasant than The Hague, and I dived into the what used to be the KTV library and then was incorporated into the University Library of Leiden University, and started rather randomly calling for women's vernacular magazines printed after 1901. And I figured out the first one is the one on the top left, Perempuan Bergerak, that is from Delhi or the Medan area, 1919. First published in 1919, and that was the first women's magazine that I could find, written in Malay, because that was one of my limitations, was that I don't read Javanese, I don't read Sundanese, I don't read any of the local vernaculars except for Malay. So that was one of my constraints. But it was the first one that came up as a vernacular language women's magazine. So that kind of became my benchmark was 1919. And then I stretched into all the way into the 50s and 60s. And so you see the titles are rather mixed, with a core in the 20s and 30s primarily. The 1930s is when the gendered vernacular press explodes in the Dutch East Indies, and also in Dutch. And so some of these magazines are in Dutch. The majority were in Malay. And some of them, the majority were from Leiden, and a bunch of them were from Cornell, where I was, especially those from the 50s and 60s, Cornell's collection started being much more useful, let's say, than for the colonial period. Let's not forget that I came into this thinking about this conversation between Islam, modernity, and politics, and imagination. And imagination also practices domination, right? What does it mean to have a post-colonial modern nation state through the lens of Islam? And that's where I had to sort of readjust my lens. And one of the approach questions that I'm not going to go into great detail now, but we can discuss in the Q&A if anybody's particularly interested, is was that actually there wasn't that much talk about Islam. As Suara Asia would be the one quote unquote religious magazine, but it was also very interesting to see how conversations were somehow compartmentalized. So there were discussions about womanhood, there were discussions about women's responsibilities in the house, there were discussions about Muslim women in other parts of the world, from Turkey to China, to India, like British India, and then there were exegesis, right? So a verse from the Quran and exegesis of that, and a cooking call. But things were not necessarily in conversations with each other, with some very notable exceptions. And so I really started to lean on those exceptions and trying to figure out where was it that Islam was coming through and what ways was it coming through. Okay. And so the one thing that really jumped out from the sources, maybe unsurprisingly, one might think, was the real continuous, sustained focus and interest in what I've come to refer to as everyday activities of care work. So how were women expected or supposed to care for their families, but also for their communities? And eventually when you go from your children to your nuclear or extended family, the village, the community, the bangsa, it becomes the nation, right? And that's where you start having these very interesting interwoven representations of how talking about caring for your child in a certain way, it is going to have an implications on what the bangsa is going to look like in 10, 15, 20 years in this undefined futurity of no longer being a colonized territory and population. And in what ways was Islam coming through? And spoiler alert, this came up especially in relationship to infant feeding, food consumption, and food consumption in general, right? And these were the two things, and I'll go into more detail into that. But so this is how it really started with the question of Muslim women's role in shaping Indonesia as a modern post-colonial nation state, and then ended up with a book titled Domestic Nationalism, in which gendered care work emerges as a contact zone. It's this blurred liminal contact zone between multiple epistemologies, so Western science, religion, traditional practices, so multiple epistemologies, private and public activities, so the home, the nation, and between national and foreign priorities. So the national priority of achieving an independent nation state, but also foreign agents and foreign actors' interest in having, for example, a productive colonized subject force, or international aid agencies in the Cold War wanted to have a way into the country when, of course, Sukarno was keeping the doors quite tightly closed, but with good openings for some drafts to go through. And the home becomes that opening. And so through the chapters, which I'll go over one by one, I show that between the 1910s and 1950s, women in Java and Sumatra forge a connection between homemaking and nation building, mediating tradition, biomedicine, and Islamic references through their mothering, consumption, and overall labor. And how colonial imperialist, independent governments, and philanthropic aids leveraged this connection between home and nation. A question I should have asked earlier: should I talk for another half an hour or more, another 15 minutes? Was a
Go for another
Okay.
20 minutes.
Okay. Yes. Let's dive in chapter by chapter, and there's going to be a lot of images. So if there's anything you want to hear, and I can talk for an hour about every single one of them, so make a note, and then I would love to tell you everything I can about every single one of them, or anybody you're interested in. So the project of modernity that administrators and politicians envisioned for the Indonesian archipelago throughout most of the 20th century were articulated in a variety of ways, from the Dutch so-called ethical policy in the early 1900s, Japan's 1940s co-prosperity sphere, and Sukarno's non-aligned politics in the 50s. But it all hinged on one necessity: productive bodies, right? And so the Dutch economic model of exploitative capitalist colonialism needed laborers and coolies. Japan's imperialist aspirations needed soldiers and laborers. The revolution needed fighters. And Sukarno's vision of manual subsistence agriculture needed farmers. And for these bodies to perform the work of modernity, they all needed to be strong and healthy, or at least healthy enough to work. European and American imperialists were already very well aware of negative impact on the economics and politics of physical illness. And that's how the Rockefeller Foundation established its early work on hookworm disease, for example, in the southern US, and expanded to the southern United States and Southern America. And this is also exactly how the field of tropical hygiene came to be in the 1880s, early 1900s, in colonial metropoles and peripheries, from London and Amsterdam to Taiwan and Batavia. Good health was presented as hygiene, and hygiene was biomedically defined cleanliness. In colonized territories, then, health and hygiene became coterminous with progress, prosperity, and Western modernity, which is very important, this distinction, because in an imperialist framework that was in operation at the time, this was invariably opposed to primitive, native practices. And you see one of them there in the Eastern and Western cures slide poster. As all workers needed to be born and well cared for in order to be productive to their full potential, the focus then zoomed in on modern birthing and infant care literacy. First through texts in Dutch, Malay, and local vernaculars. And these texts were produced alongside efforts that were hands-on, let's say, in training traditional birthing assistance into modern hygienic birthing practices. For example, colonials or American Rockefeller Foundation funded inspectors would go and remind traditional dukuns or specifically birthing dukuns how they should wash their hands or they should sanitize the tools. And the sense was a high degree of racialization and civilizational difference discourse in which the natives, quote unquote, wouldn't understand the principles of good hygiene because they didn't know the science, so they would not understand the science. So for the colonial administration, colonized women in Java and Sumatra, and this to me was very interesting to kind of realize this dichotomy or this contrast, were both their greatest asset because they were mothers of exploitable subjects, but they were also the greatest threat as Native women were identified as the first culprits for the high rates of infant mortality. So instead of going in an introspective effort of thinking, oh, maybe the way that we have led the urbanization and the economic change of our colonies have led to higher pollution in the water and a change in the way in which people live, it was, oh, you don't understand science. You don't understand that dirt makes you sick, right? And so it was a very different vocabulary being used. In this vision, indigenous women did not just lack knowledge, which of course could have been provided, as was happening, for example, with the women proletariat in early industrializing Britain or anywhere across industrializing Europe. But they were also seen as being held back from trusting science by their beliefs in superstition, reliance on traditional healers, and ultimate submission to what Christian colonizers saw as a false religion, Islam. So as in other colonial contexts, Islam was framed as a backward force, keeping believers ignorant and unable to modernize. And women in particular were seen as disenfranchised from society, oppressed by the man, and by religious practices specifically. So while these specific health propaganda efforts address women as mothers in the 19-teens, 1920s, broader colonial endeavors in health literacy primarily targeted men. And so these were very common documentation that you would find in Rockefeller Foundation archives and various publications on rural hygiene work, which marginalized women and took a biomedical approach that also excluded religion. A similar strategy was taken by the Rockefeller Foundation. It wasn't just the Dutch colonial government. And so the Rockefeller Foundation in the 1920s and 30s was a major player in rural hygiene work in the Indies. Notably, though, it would be an American physician, John Lee Heydrich, who was in charge of this project, who would be the first one in recognizing the limits of this approach. And you can see that that's the caption to that picture. Published on his publication. It says public lectures are not of great values. And yet that was the primary MO for throughout the 1920s and very early 1930s. But in the early 30s, he shifted his attention to women, both as healthcare professionals. So here you see a monthly nurse who has been working propaganda for 2 years, and that's from the Rockefeller Foundation, and also as targets of rural hygiene propaganda. And so you see there is a house visit from a woman to a woman, and this was labeled as being the most effective modality of rural hygiene work. Now, the Dutch approach of sidelining women and religion was quite unique to the Dutch East Indies, because in Euro-America, both women and religious Christian values had been placed at the very center of sanitary reforms and propaganda. Interestingly, though, when targeting Muslim women, not just in the Dutch East Indies, but also, for example, Iran and Egypt, for example, public health campaigns were secularized and presented as exclusively scientific and modern, or based on ideas of womanly duties. But Islam was constantly taken out of the conversation because Islam could not be seen as being part of this modernizing effort. So one of the things I was most interested in is the fact that while the Dutch colonizers were shaping the hygiene discourse in the Indies as male, modern, scientific, and Western, colonized subjects, including women, had their own understanding and their own views of this and pushback. They had their own ideas. The burgeoning gender press of the 19 teens and 30s was saturated with articles on mothering, infant care, hygiene, and progress. Often these articles frame motherhood as crucial to imperialist nationalism. We can think about imperial maternalism, which is something of which many scholars have written about. But I argue that often this was taken in a very different direction by Indonesian authors, especially Indonesian women authors, compared to what you would read in the Dutch press, even in the Indies. Inspired by news about the women's movement and nationalist movements in China, India, Turkey, the Philippines, for example, women writers in Java and Sumatra offered a discursive re-articulation of mothering as progress, adding their own perspective as colonized Muslim subjects. And so they presented motherhood as a force for anti-imperialist nationalism, really, in a way, flipping the imperial maternalism's approach, which was we need mothers to establish a nationalist imperialist nation. Colonized subjects were saying, yes, we need modern mothering, but as a reaction against imperialism. And this was done in a very conscious and explicit manner. So in this second, in this second chapter, which is titled Labor, and the following one is titled Food, I show that in their everyday engagements, women combine new and old knowledge and practices, in some cases following biomedical principles, and in others abiding by Islamic precepts. And often the framing of these choices and actions was presented as aimed at strengthening the emerging nation, aimed at a forward movement, so kemajuan, right? This idea of progress as almost a literal move, which had political implications. It was not just, I want my child to be safe. I want my child to be well nourished. We need this because we need to be able to assert ourselves as a nation vis-a-vis the colonizing force. Some women, mostly elite or upper middle class, who were literate, worked as healthcare professionals, as I was showing you before, right? Others of similar extraction were writing about care work through the lenses of science, religion, and traditions, and made explicit the relationship between mothering and socioeconomic advancement, as well as nation building. But of course, there were many other women who labored at home and in their communities with few, if any, skills and literacy levels, but there were still, I argue, very much imbued in this understanding of domestic, community-oriented care work as crucial and necessary for the advancement of the nation as a no longer colonial or an anti-colonial effort. And that's something that I'm able to unpack only through images and visual sources as opposed to textual sources. Now, food, and I'm going to say if anybody wanted to pick one chapter to read, I think that you can skip chapter 1 and 2 and just jump into 3. You're interested in the colonial period because everything comes together with food, and maybe it's because I'm obsessed with food. That's why it all comes together there. But I think that food really becomes a very generative space for this intersection of scientific knowledge, hygienic reforms, traditional practices, mothering, religious identity, and nation building, and it all comes together in a very, I think, telling way. I'm gonna try and zoom in on 3 points. First of all, piling on existing concerns about foodborne diseases, the discovery of vitamins added a new layer to the presence of biomedicine in the kitchen. So we go from hygiene to nutrition. But interestingly, Eichmann discovers, and he eventually gets the Nobel Prize for the discovery of vitamin B, being in the husk of rice. And he makes this discovery working in Batavia, in Dutch colonized Java. And so they start popularizing eating brown rice versus eating white rice. And it's actually really interesting, almost funny, borderline comical, to read the way in which Indonesian women were writing about this. I was like, okay, like you call this vitamin B, and you made this rocket science discovery, but this is what we've always been eating. We've always known that brown rice is more nutritious than white rice, and that's our diet in the countryside. You tell us that bananas have vitamin A, great, but you know what? My grandmother, whenever she saw a baby who was failing to thrive, she would give bananas to the baby because we knew the bananas were good. And so there is this way of saying, yes, you have science, but we have our practices. And so, yes, you're validating what we've been doing all along, but hey, we've been doing this all along. And the way that this is talked about, it's, and that's why I talk about epistemological resistance. I talk about this way of embracing the domestic as a space for pushing back and really pushing back against this perceived civilizational difference that the Dutch were so involved and so invested into promoting from a scientific point of view. So the second aspect comes with infant feeding. And so doctors, public opinion, and mothers across the ethnic divide, let's say, contended over whether breastfeeding or bottle feeding was best in terms of hygiene, nutrition, and overall modernity of behavior. So while the colonial press promoted bottle feeding as a marker of modernity, and you see the 1926 advertisement, as a marker of modernity to which even the native could aspire, indigenous upper class women wrote on the vernacular press about the benefits of breastfeeding. Notably, they framed this in hygienic and nutritious terms. So we say it's less likely that a breastfed child will get cholera because I don't need to figure out how to use clean water to sanitize bottles. And if you are this young girl here who's put in charge of taking care of her younger sibling when her parents are gone, it's hard to picture absolute sanitation without hygienization and sanitation without possibly getting scolded with hot hair. I mean, hot water, I start thinking, I go in mother mode and say, I would never put my 9-year-old in charge of sterilizing a bottle because there's more problems that might emerge, right? It was more nutritious because most women, most native indigenous women would have only been able to afford likely skimmed, sweetened condensed milk, which was the cheapest option, but was definitely not nutritious enough for an infant. And ultimately, the Quran says that you need to breastfeed your child for 2 years. And so that's where Islam comes in. Say, not only this is the most hygienic option, is the most nutritious option, but hey, let's not forget, the Quran says so. And you read this in non-explicitly religious publications. So I didn't find this on Swarashia. I found this on the Eskis newsletter, which was you would say a non-religious, secular, non-committal women's magazine from Western Sumatra. So a third point concerns halal certification products. In the 1930s depression that I had, so European and American products were seeking a new consumer base in the colonized territories. And I'm sure that anybody who spent time in Indonesia will recognize both Maggi and Blue Band as very common products until today. And they've been on the market in the Indies since the 1880s. But is in the early 1930s, the first Maggi that I found as being advertised as halal was 1932. European and American products were seeking a new consumer base in colonized territories. And as hygiene and vitamins had become prominent in the field of advertising, so did Islam. So throughout the 1930s, several products were not just clean, healthy, nutritious with added vitamins, but they were also certified halal. And twist in that, those who were doing the certification was the colonial laboratory. And so there was quite some debate over, can we trust this? Is this true? There had been a scandal in Singapore over which I haven't really been able to find the details, but public opinion in Java and Sumatra were pointing at Singapore saying, well, there was that scandal in Singapore. Who tells us that this is actually halal? And to me, what is most fascinating is that these debates, this questioning, and especially the reassurance that these products were truly halal, including a very lengthy article by Haji Abu Salim that gets published in so many publications verbatim, it always appears on women's magazines. So it's never on the general press, it's always on dedicated women's magazines. And so whereas we can discuss the use of advertisements as historical sources, and there are a lot of challenges in doing that, I want to flag here that these were the first public platforms in which the weight of gendered labor and gender care work in matters of hygiene, care, nutrition, and piety is made visible and is recognized as a space for women's discussion or agency or even authority. So if in the eyes of the colonial administration, indigenous women were marginal to the hygienic efforts, as I was saying earlier on, even though it was them who did all the work. On the other hand, advertisers seemed to realize it was women who made purchasing decisions and therefore exerted authority in matters of nutrition, hygiene, but also Islamic compliance. So the voices and experiences presented in chapters 1, 2, and 3, so hygiene, labor, and food, to me bring together women's gender labor and their elaborations of it as a pillar of advancement, so kemajuan, providing the building blocks of the framework of domestic nationalism, the theoretical framework that I'm trying to apply across time. But it is in chapter 4 that this first layer of Indonesia's domestic nationalism becomes actually visible, coming to the surface as the war engendered a social, political, and economic environment in which care work and hygiene were both primary fields for the employment of female labor and crucial ones for the emergence of the nation state. Change came very suddenly in the 40s, and maybe some Indonesians, some Indonesians are very uncomfortable with thinking about the 1940s as a unit of time because so much changed. Right? You have the coda, you have the end of the uninterrupted Dutch colonial presence. You have the Japanese invasion. You have revolution with the Dutch attempted return, and you have the Declaration of Independence, like the recognition of Indonesia's independence by international actors. And on top of this, as one unit of time, being characterized by war, and thinking about war as a moment of trauma, especially for women during the Japanese occupation, but also a moment of opportunity. And this is something that is written about a lot more in studies of World War I and World War II in Europe and America, in which women started having an opportunity, quote unquote, or being forced or having to join the productive workforce because men were drafted. But it was also what opened up many spaces for women in the public sphere, and this is more rarely talked about in the case of Asia, and even more so in Muslim majority countries. This is, at least I have ideas as per why that's the case. It would be really interesting to see more comparative work being done in terms of what were some of the ways in which war opened up these opportunities, despite the terrible human experiences that also happened during, especially the Japanese occupation across Southeast Asia and East Asia. But so not only did women become the bulk of the wage labor force, they also witnessed how the home front turned into the front line of war. Women were trained as food providers, healthcare professionals, tasked with teaching their neighbors in women's associations. Their previously ordinary tasks of care work were mobilized first by the occupation regime and then by the revolutionary effort, becoming visible as fundamental to the armed and political struggle throughout the decade. So alongside the trauma of war, and specifically the sexual violence that implicated women, the Japanese occupation opened up new paths for women to participate in the public realm and be seen. And I think that the public, the popular representations attest to that. And a trend that would continue throughout the revolution in the second half of the 40s and into the 50s. After the war, Indonesian women did not retreat from the frontline position that they had taken, and I'm very intentional about saying that they took that frontline position. And in fact, in the early years after the 1949 transfer of sovereignty, they were at the head of key strategies spearheading Indonesia's quest for socioeconomic prosperity. So references to Islam become even more scarce at this point in time. Yet very often women were presented as Muslim. And Islam is also marginal in the 1950s public discourse, with some exceptions. So cooking columns, for example, always very nonchalantly comment on a need to substitute chicken for pork fat, in a very obvious saying. And of course, we are translating this, culturally translating this Chinese recipe, but of course we will use chicken because it's forbidden. Pork is forbidden. And again, this would be in a nationalist magazine, right? It wouldn't be in a Suara Asia again. Reformist women, but in Suara Asia, this becomes more evident. And so there's this amazing article that I love, published in the early 50s, with a woman writing about Aisha and Khadija, among other foundational female figures of Islam, as examples of pious mothers and wives who interwove their gender roles with public, political, economic roles. And more fundamentally, some doctors will even invoke Islamic principles when presenting articles in favor of family planning. And I'm going to return to this in my very last remarks.
Maybe about 5 minutes.
Yes, yeah. Excellent. So as Indonesia had become a recognized independent nation state, so domestic work was recognized as fundamental to the goal of independence. No longer relegated to remain behind the scenes, now the reach of the domestic arena had expanded, encompassing in a single discursive domain, home and nation at once. The national government embarked on a task of upbuilding, with public health at the forefront of this endeavor, and specifically nutrition and infant care as its core endeavor. On the one hand, these were spaces of opportunity for women to expand the reach of their ascribed gender roles and to have an effect on domestic nationalist politics. They contributed to nation building as home-based caregiver, but also as paid, professionalized outreach workers, but also as policymakers. Women were now in charge of activities seen as key to national development, framing them explicitly as professional activities with political goals, not social ones, which is how the narrative would be turned in the 1960s, especially during the New Order regime. On the other hand, as Sukarno laid out a non-aligned political platform of political and economic self-reliance in the context of the emergent Cold War, maternal and child health and nutrition became areas of opportunity for international aid agencies with their own agendas. And I hope you all noticed that milk and cheese are written in English here on this 1952 publication. And I can talk at length about that. International aid agencies came to see value in influencing those gendered home domestic activities that had already been linked to nationalist agenda and policies of national development to bring in their own agendas in the Cold War. So this is where the dual analytical framework of domestic nationalism becomes clearest, at least to me. So as the putatively separate spheres of home domestic and national public had become blurred in the pre-independence era, in the polarizing global politics and putatively hard borders of national and international spheres were similarly blurred in the 50s. The expanded domestic arena included the additional domain of geopolitical liminality. The recognition of a political impact for women's everyday activities of care work had been realized, but did not last long, okay? The book concludes with a reality check. The epilogue makes clear that with Sukarno's declaration of martial law in 1957 and then guided democracy in 1959, the emergent hyper-masculine post-colonial military state came to mirror colonial era dynamics of marginalizations. It marginalized women's agency, and it continued to disregard Islam as a potential driver of progress. And this, to me, becomes really clear in debates about family planning. In the 1950s, the West, and explicitly the US-based Population Council, presented this family planning as a solution to overpopulation, hunger in the undeveloped countries, and one necessary push for anti-communist geopolitical Cold War priorities, right? In Indonesia, local doctors advocated, and among them women, promoted birth spacing, but never really spoke to the question of reducing population numbers. They focused on women's health and arguing how it would not be uncommon for a young woman in her 20s, for example, to have 5 or 6 pregnancy, and that being a major issue, especially in nation building, because then you have weak children and you also have weakened mothers, right? Because the health of the woman suffers. And then there was Islamically sanctioned strategy of family planning in terms of birth spacing for social and economic well-being under the label of maslahah. Now, Sukarno's political economy promoted manual subsistence agriculture, which privileged a nativist policy. And so he completely shuts down any and every conversation about family planning in the late 50s or throughout the 50s. And the health of women's bodies, which had originally been so important in the colonial period, to start sanitary reforms, were set aside as a priority in favor of a shift in understanding what it meant to be prosperous in a very different economic and political environment. So both women and religion would be gradually excluded from the halls of power and eventually relegated to a clearly defined social sphere of volunteering, which is what the New Order mandated. And they would have nothing to contribute to politics besides the reproduction of a patriarchal authoritarian state. And that's it. Thank you. There is a lot.
Thank you, Chiara. Any comments or questions? Yes, Aoife.
No, thank you so much for sharing. This is really interesting. First of all, I just wanted to know, like, within the time span, I think you're trying to see it from late 1910s until like 1950s. But like during that period, there's already like some Islamic organizations in Indonesia, like Nahdlatul Ulama or
Yeah.
Muhammadiyah. I wanted to know like how these organizations kind of like influence and yeah.
No, that's a great question. And that's where I'm not looking at all the sources possible, kind of plugging my ear, came up.
Because most of the Suarezia and Muhammadiyah, Almanacs, and all the publications are in Jakarta. I couldn't really find a good span, a good range of them. In Sweden, there were major gaps, and Cornell doesn't have any. And so I kept thinking, okay, there is going to be more. Once I make it to Jakarta, it's going to be all laid out there because Muhammadiyah was so proactive in terms of establishing clinics, and Nahdlatul Ulama as well was very conscious about the priorities of hygiene and sanitation and mothering and all of that. And I was very disappointed. I mean, I was both disappointed and reassured, but I found that I hadn't missed anything. It's very interesting to read how most, not all, but especially from the 30s on, Muhammadiyah discourse really separates science from Islam. And there were some doctors who would occasionally kind of play the religion card to say, especially when they were talking to men, you need to take care of, your paddy fields and make sure that there is no mosquitoes festering. Islam tells us we need to be clean. Sort of out of context. To me, still feeling a little bit out of context. But the conversations about women's clinics, about having to bring your children to be weighed and checked upon, and all of that were always very science-oriented, medicalized conversations in which religion did not come. There are some writings, and those are more in the 1920s, where you see some words being used with multiple meanings. And so here, for example, which is a 1930 publication, that you have this idea of suci. And suci being used here as being, it's spelled with ty, chi, right? It's compiled as ty in the Dutch spelling. Being this idea of murni, so kind of being pure, both in terms of being physically clean and hygienic, but also being pure because it's not haram. This was something that you'll find more in Muhammadiyah already, maybe from the early 20s, but then it disappears. It all becomes very Dutch language, Malay eyes, Dutch language, or just Dutch words to talk about hygiene and cleanliness and so on and so forth. And it's very interesting because I thought that was one of my assumptions.
Yeah.
That Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah were really going to ride with us, with hygiene being the religious principle that was going to leverage rural hygiene work. And it was not, which even in silence and its absence, to me was very interesting to reflect on. Yeah.
Yeah. Very fun.
I like having fun in here because I teach media classes on a day-to-day basis. And I teach in the sessions when I teach feminism and media studies, I always, of course my classes are not about Indonesia. I usually bring in examples from the US, right? So I'm going to use your book. I hope all of these photos are in your book because, for instance, the reading on symbolic annihilation in mass media, that's a very classic feminist read on mass media, how women were doubly oppressed, not just when they're first of all, they're not represented usually, but when they are represented, they're represented in a very limited way as a mother, as a caretaker, just like in all of these pictures. So that's But anyway, two questions. I was wondering if there were debates between different publishers and between different groups of women and organizations in which these publications belong to, in terms of, this idea of domestic nationalism, so to speak, in a very general way. What were the debates among them? What were at stake for them? I noticed particularly that you don't mention this in your, I haven't read your book, but you don't mention the communist women, for instance, because they did talk at length about issues on health and childcare from a Islamic, but also nationalist and communist perspective. So that's my first questions. What were the debates like, especially in 1910s, all the way, if you look at it from the perspective of domestic nationalism in Indonesia in the 20th century? How do you map that debates? If you can, you don't have to, we can talk about it later as well. And then the second one, I was curious, again, from media studies perspective, about the producers. Who were the producers of these newspapers? What were their agenda? And, behind the scene, yes, they showed these women and, the other one about Blue Band, for instance. Were there, were they motivated by the advertisers, were the content a reflection of a broader structure of feeling of the period, or rather it's something driven also by these companies, or probably also global discourses? So I'm curious from the producer's perspective, how it's like.
So the first question, for these are excellent questions. So to me, one of the interesting things to note, it was that rather than thinking in terms of debates, it was more like parallel, and I think about debates as kind of intersecting lines. There were a lot of parallel lines. And the same publication, the same magazine could one week advocate for, have an article advocate for one thing, and then the following week or the following month mentioning something else. So in that sense, it's worth noting that there were, I don't say ecumenical, but, especially about breastfeeding versus bottle feeding, even the Dutch language publications would present alternating views on what's best, or what are the pros and cons of the various strategies. It was the same with the vernacular Malay language magazines. And so there you see the diversity of opinions. But I would say that in the Malay language press, my sense was that it was thinking particularly in terms of imperial maternalism, which I think is one point where everything comes together in a way, in terms of hygiene or care work, modern hygiene, medicalization, and modern motherhood, to overlay an American term, scientific motherhood, and being Indonesian and a local identity of some sort, and the nation. That juncture there, I find in the Malay language articles authored by Javanese or Sumatran authors, it was the maternalism and the imperialism was always framed as a subjecthood position. So it was not, we need to be strong mothers and have strong children to assert ourselves on others, but it was always about pushing back and asserting ourselves. In that sense, to me, it really, and maybe it's because I'm Italian and I was socialized in the terms of history learning of maternal imperialism or imperial maternalism in a fascist European sense of strong mothers for a strong nation because you need to take over somebody else, right? This is a very flipped reaction. And that, to me, if I needed to think in terms of patterns, that would be a pattern. The role of Islam is there, is not there, is very latent. So I keep thinking of this and talking about this as an Islamic ethos, in the sense that it's not always, oh, Islam says, the Quran says, and the Imam has said, the reason this strong, assertive thing that I would have read from couples of videos ready, right? So to me, that is in your face, and we need to make a point about this being Islamic. It's more like, obviously we'll do. It's like this kind of Islam being everywhere, but really not being a hegemonic force that is imposed on. Is more like, this is the discursive environment that we inhabit. And so that's how we talk about this. But then there is the communist aspect of it, which is something I consciously did not get into it.
Oh.
No, because I thought there is more scholarship on that, right? I think in a footnote, I pushed back on, for example, Apikartini, which Saskia Virga defines as kind of having these almost clickbait articles on care, on domestic care, just to attract women readers to then talk about politics. And I pushed back a little bit against that, saying I don't think those were clickbaits. I mean, because she used the bait first, like baiting readers into reading about care, so to deliver a political message. And my point is that these messages are not separate. They are together. The care work message is a political message. If that answers that question. And the producers, that was most of the time, it's really important. To me, it was almost impossible to figure out who was bankrolling any of this. Who was doing the drawing? I mean, here I know that this is Van den Berg, but Van den Berg is the name of the distributor of the actual cans, right, of Blue Band and Lactogen. So I don't know whether they had an artist in the family who made the drawing. Those questions remain really unanswered. What is interesting to me is that this very advertisement is also reproduced on Panji Pustaka, which is a Malay publication, very broadly and well received, but never with a caption, right? So that caption, who said the native is backward, it's only in this Dutch language, Orientalist, very, very clear, ethicist but imperialist publication.
Can I ask a follow-up question? So you keep saying it's magazine. Are they magazine or newspapers?
They are mostly magazines.
They call themselves magazine, Majalah.
Well, they're categorized as such. They're not daily.
They're not daily.
They're not
I
daily.
see. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Some of them look like
And they don't.
newspaper copy, for example, Perempuan Bergerak. It's like, okay. So most of them are like 2 sheets, right? I mean, they're big. You would think of them as the New York Times today in terms of production, but they're only issued once a month or every other month or possibly bi-weekly, right? But they're not daily. Yeah.
And they don't belong to an organization.
Some of them do,
They're
some of them
commercial.
don't. Yeah.
So
And so
like-
they are around for maybe a year or 2 years, and then they no longer have funds. So Suara Ibu and Perempuan Bergerak, those are quote unquote maybe independent in a way. Then you have Suara Kamu Ibu Sumatra, Eskis, that belongs to an organization. Istri, and the name becomes Istri Indonesia, belongs to a very important organization. Mhm. Yeah, that runs from 1929, I think, is the first publication. Yeah, so they really depend. It's a little bit all over the place.
Okay, I promise this is the last thing. I'm just curious if behind these publications are actually men targeting women to be the consumers. And so this is a projection of women and their basically ideal task niche as as a citizen to care for caretaking. And once we see it that way, then I think there needs to be like it opens up for a more critical lens of thinking about what are the possibilities that women could have,
And so Perempuan Bergerak had a female editor-in-chief who writes an opening piece, like an op-ed on a very first issue. And it's very interesting. because she kind of intersperses all these Dutch words, including hygiene and caretaking, but then also talks about feminisme and a feminisme that doesn't go against our agama, right? And so it's like the choice of word and the way in which things are talked about, it's fascinating. And that's why I keep saying this, like, some articles are straight up European propaganda. Women, you have to be strong because the nation that relies on you, and others are a little more. And and those that are from women's organizations, I like to think that their agenda is shaped by a patriarchal society and worldviews. But to me, one big point about the book, and I haven't used the word agency much during the talk because I always get myself in trouble when I do that. But for me, one big part of this is to say we cannot keep reading all of this as women projecting what men thought they should do, and caregiving just being a space, limiting, narrowing space in which they operate, and they can fantasize about how they're contributing to the nation, but ultimately they're really just scrubbing the toilet. No, I really want to make a point about the fact that many of them, not all of them have been given the tools to make explicit that what they were doing was for the nation. But I also like to think that the nurse or the mantri, where is she? They are working, thinking that they can improve their lives, that they can do something. And then whether it is helping the neighbor, helping a stranger, or caring properly for their own children is for more than just what they're supposed to be doing. And some of them can express that in words, and some of them don't have the tools for that, but we can't take that agency away from them.
Can I ask a question on that?
Yeah.
Because one of the things that struck me about the book was that I thought there were some places where you were suggesting that the women were projecting an aim which I wasn't convinced by the argumentation. So one example is on the food.
Yeah.
So on the idea that breastfeeding, eating brown rice, eating bananas is a desirable thing, but it's also conditional practices. It almost seemed like there was an implication that because these weren't a direct response to Western modernity, that therefore they were consciously a resistance against Western modernization. And I thought, well, they could just be a default position for these women who were continuing practices. It didn't have to be that they were seeing these practices as the antithesis of modern practices.
No, absolutely. I absolutely agree. And I think that if I remember correctly, trying to frame this as an epistemological resistance in the sense of really being based on the way in which things are talked about and pushing back against an overwhelming amount of didactic publications that were coming out and kind of teaching and I didn't talk about the fairs and the hygiene and various pasar malam exhibits that would go on, right? The colonial exhibits, but kind of this very didactic efforts to teach the natives how to progress in a framework that was explicitly Western. And so to me, the resistance is not to the idea of eating brown rice because it's good for you, but it's a resistance against that being Western knowledge.
Or something new.
Or something new and being the outcome of Western advanced scientific methods of inquiry.
Okay, and one other
Yeah,
example is just, is on the Rockefeller Foundation.
Yes.
So I absolutely buy that international agencies then, and maybe now,
Mhm.
have their own agenda,
Yes.
and that, especially Rockefeller Foundation early on it was heavily influenced by Christian ideas and so on. But it seems a little bit like throwing the baby out with the bathwater if you look at John Heidink or whatever
Oh,
his name
hydrant. No,
is.
I love hydrant.
Okay, because that doesn't come through in the book.
Oh.
He's still,
He's
it's on
not a villain. He's the one who's not a villain.
yeah, because he sees women
Yes.
as the key, but it's somehow as though he's still operating within that mode of an imperialist aid agency. And I think that at least he ought to be given some credit for triumphing over it in a
No,
way.
yes, no, absolutely. I spent a delightful weekend without my family at home, reading through his diary. Like, he was my companion as I kept, uh, kept thinking, why are the Dutch not engaging with women? They keep having all these posters and all these exhibits and all these things about cleanliness and caring for the babies. And then you look at the pictures and it's all men everywhere. It's like, don't they realize that it's the women doing all the work? I mean, also look around today. I mean, women do most of this care work. And then I started reading his diary and he has this, and I quote him at length. Actually, I had to get permission from the Rockefeller Foundation to quote him at such length, but he says, I need to push back. I mean, I understand that traditionally in the past, rural hygiene work here has focused on men, but I don't think that's the best way. I think that where I see impact is when women are brought on board. And he fights really hard to have a woman to be the director of the the hygiene Mantri school, to make sure that it is a woman, because he thinks that the woman will attract more women as inspectors, as students. And those are those that actually can build a connection with the women in the villages, who then do all the work on making sure that the colonized subjects and coolies and laborers are stronger. So he still operates within, he operates within an imperialist framework.
Yeah, but there's some
But-
objective goods that
Yes.
come out of it, yeah.
No,
yeah.
absolutely,
Yeah.
yes.
I have a two-finger. I'm so curious of why it was the Rockefeller Foundation
Mm.
during the colonial
Yeah.
period that would be working in Indonesia. What's that story?
Well, the bottom line is because the Dutch didn't have money and they couldn't care less to invest more money into their colony. But the Rockefeller Foundation first arrives, they've been very strong, of course, in the Philippines.
Mhm.
And so in the 19 teens, I think it's 1915 or 1916, the director, the person who was the physician in charge of Rockefeller operations in the Philippines becomes the director of the whole health division, and he takes a tour of Asia. And he arrives in Java upon invitation of the colonial government, and he goes around Batavia, and he realizes that sanitary conditions are pretty bad, and hookworm disease is everywhere, right? And hookworm disease was labeled by the Rockefeller Foundation, was a doctor and an employee of the Rockefeller Foundation, was called the germ of laziness, because its primary side effect is lethargy, right? So, and this was a huge problem in the southern US that relied on human labor, enslaved labor, indentured labor, to produce the economic profits of the United States, right? In the late 1800s and early 1900s. And that's why hookworm disease becomes the focus of the Rockefeller Foundation philanthropy. Is a very capitalist economic desire there that pushes them spend money to make more money. But so they're invited, or they're allowed to just say, yeah, sure, come. Hi, sir, come. He comes, he notices that conditions are terrible. He writes a report. And the Dutch government is not pleased with that report because it says, yes, the natives don't know how to take care of themselves, but also the Dutch have done a very poor job with their immigration and with their irrigation system, and there is no way to keep the cities sanitized and so on and so forth. And the Dutch just get really pissed off and say, well, you know what? You're not welcome here anymore. And it takes them 10 years,
Wow.
8 to 10 years of correspondence until the governor, the general governor changes in the Dutch East Indies, and there's all new players. And then the Rockefeller Foundation is re-invited. At that point is the late 20s, 1924, 1925. And they're invited on the Rockefeller on dime. And then the Dutch colonial government was supposed to chip in into all this endeavor, but then the 1930s crisis hits, and that creates more problems. But Heydrich is the one who keeps writing to the offices in New York City, saying we need to keep this going because we're having excellent results. People are healthier. People are learning about these things, but also there is more local healthcare professionals who are being trained, and they are developing their own ways, so it is, today we would call it capacity building. He doesn't fully embody and exude the imperialist, really healthier workers for the colony, but he works within that system. But yeah, so that's why the Rockefeller. Oh, yeah.
Well, I don't know if you could see, but we have some questions in the
Oh, oh.
webinar,
Yes.
in the Q&A. I can also read it if that's easier.
To read it.
You
Okay.
cannot see it.
Okay, so this question's from Rina Priani. They're kind of long, just to warn you. She says, thank you for your fantastic presentation. I'm an architectural historian and an Indonesian woman, so I'm curious about hygiene, modernity, and the material culture in the 1930s to 1960s Indonesia, specifically in Java and Sumatra. I keep thinking of how the bamboo vernacular house, as it depicts in some pictures, is being demolished and changed into a modern house for cleanliness and being modern. That was a question, sorry. A similar trajectory in that thinking is also about the vernacular dapur, or outside, that shifted to the inside of a house. What do you think about these modern domestic cases?
Yes, so thank you for the question. Architecture is another thing that really fascinates me. So part of the bit of the sanitary reforms in the way in which the Dutch, so I guess I should look there at the camera. The way that the Dutch were advancing them was very infrastructural. That was some of the earliest moves, was infrastructural, because then they didn't really need to deal with the natives, but it also was a way to protect themselves. So housing, the shift from bamboo housing, which was seen, was considered, especially during the plague epidemic, was seen as a repository for rats, rodents, and all sorts of pests. There was the rebuilding of markets, wet markets, dry markets, and abattoirs, or slaughterhouses. Thank you. Slaughterhouses and milking facilities. So milk is a huge thing for me. I could have written this book as a history of milk in Indonesia, and pretty much it would have been a very similar narrative, actually, but just structured very differently. Felt a little broader than that as I started writing it. But the slaughterhouses, and that's where also Islam comes in, this idea of separating, having halal slaughtering facilities, but definitely into architecture, there's the whole material aspect of it, which is substituting concrete substituting bamboo for concrete, and making sure the markets and slaughterhouses would have concrete floors and being able to be washed thoroughly, and have, be a little bit of an incline so you can throw water and the water goes out, but then it goes into little boats, which is slats, to kind of to drain the water and the blood or everything out, and it's easier to clean. And you have a small diorama and reproductions of these being showcased at the various hygiene exhibitions at the Pasar Malam all across the country. Those really go everywhere in the country. That actually opens, we were just chatting earlier, I was saying how hard it is to kind of talk about Indonesia when the sources focus on Java and Sumatra. But so much of this knowledge was being produced, including the Rockefeller Foundation rural hygiene programming units that were being developed in Java and then transported across the country. And so you would have similar units in Bali, Lombok, and even further east. You would have this, the dioramas created for hygiene exhibitions in Java, then traveling all across the colony for local pasar malams, whether it's for for Christmas or for the birth of the prophet, depending on the demographics of the place. But yes, architecture is a whole other aspect.
She had a specific question about dapur, about the kitchen being inside or outside the house. Was something there
I think
about
so.
dapur?
I didn't hear that, sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, the second question, similar trajectory, thinking about the vernacular dapur that shifted to the inside of a house.
Actually, there is, because, especially in this is fascinating. 1933, hygiene exhibition in Pasar Gambir had a competition for children to make drawings about the hygienic kitchen versus an unhygienic kitchen or house. The kitchen is usually outside. It's still outside in this period. And it's talked about as being an outside space. So that's not yet within the picture, the inside kitchen. I think it's more of a post-war kind of 1950s public housing development shift to having the house inside, but the bathroom still outside. And also in this scenario, another big push alongside as part of the hookworm disease eradication, it was the building of latrines. So as dedicated spaces, but always outside of the house and at a certain distance from the house.
Okay.
I think there's another question kind of related to the gender dynamics. Okay, I'm gonna try doing the answer live. Do you see answered? I could still read it again, otherwise.
Oh, Q&A here, sorry.
Do you see it?
You want to review what I think? Open, no?
Okay, I could.
Oh,
yeah.
Take on yourself for the list? Yeah, okay. Thanks, Chiara, for the engaging presentation. The structure of the book already suggests a very clear narrative, I hope. And I'm looking forward to reading it in full. I wanted to ask about something related to gender consumption in the same period. In my research on early 20th century advertising, I want to hear more. I came across an advertorial for a women's underarm whitening product. Yes, but its model is whitening, yeah.
Underarm whitening product.
Have it in the
It's like a
Philippines.
deodorant.
Yeah.
But the testimonial is written by the husband saying something along the lines of, my wife's underarms have become whiter. The woman has no textual voice. The proof of efficacy is framed through male approval. My question is, how do you see this dynamic where products marketed to women are articulated through male authority fitting into your argument of domestic nationalism? Does this reinforce the idea of women as objects of national discipline, or does it suggest a more complex negotiation inside a household? Thank you. This is an awesome question, and I would love to hear more or read more about what you've been writing. Let me see if I'm wondering if I have a picture of another advertisement, but it's really hard. Going back to something that Rian was saying, like the authorial voice in advertisement is really hard, and it's really hard to determine, and there are so many layers to it, right? So to me here, there is the idea of, so there is race, class, and gender, right? We have these three big categories and taxonomies that are constantly in your face in advertisement, and they are thought of in that way. I mean, they're explicitly so. And there is the indigenous woman bottle feeding the child, and that's made even more explicit by the caption. But here, for example, the magi, it's really said that the cook says, right? And so there is this voice that is being put in the servant, because this is obviously a cocky babu, or think of her as you will, but she is a servant. She's squatting on the floor. Her posture and clothing marks her not just in terms of gender, but also class and obviously race, which is very different. I contrast this to some other advertisements, which I cannot remember what I have here for the Maggie, for the Maggie Cube, which is the Dutch, which is in Dutch newspapers, and it's the women are sitting, they're using maki or they're eating maki, but they're sitting at the dining table, have the bob haircut, right? So it's very different. In terms of authorial voice, it's really hard. Again, here you have another magi advertisement with the wife taking care of her husband, who's speaking for him. I don't know. I guess there is no straight answer to the question, because it's very complex, and I still today, I read letters to the editors of the magazines that I read, and sometimes, you know, you hear like one person speaking for another, and does he take agency away or not? Could his wife be literal? Was she literal or not? Are we putting in too much weight on the fact that he's speaking about what he appreciates about his wife? I don't know. I think there are many questions, and just in the same way in which I'm trying to think about agency, and especially colonized brown Muslim women as not being pigeonholed into being subjects of their racialized, religious, gendered identities in a specific historical moment as being deprived of their agency. I also like to think that maybe there is more than one could make out of that voice without ignoring the fact that, yes, some women are spoke for, you know, as our men speak for their wives. But I don't know. I don't want a blanket categorization just because we can't read it. Because the text says one thing, it doesn't mean we can't read it in a multiplicity of ways.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Other
but it was a
questions?
great question.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Does anybody, I already asked one, so I'd love to hear a bit more on how you think of this process you describe of embracing the domestic as a way of fighting back against the colonial powers. How does that work? And how does tell me more.
Any more specifics or
How
some?
you use those words.
Yeah.
Of embracing the domestic as a way of fighting back. And I want to hear more about what that means.
Yeah, I think it means different, it operationalizes itself in different ways and different historical moments. And that's why I was trying to think in smaller ways. But
In a way, it's what the book says is that it varies from time period to time period.
Yes.
During the war,
Yes.
it was one way of fighting back, right?
which was very physical
Right.
Yeah.
in that way, right?
Yeah.
So you were talking about, this was in the food chapter, and it
Yes.
was definitely a colonial period where there was this intersection of the hygiene
Yeah.
language, the science language,
Yeah.
and then the domestic became the place of fighting back. That's the
Yeah,
period
yeah,
I want to hear
yes.
about.
And so one of the ways, again, even within the food chapter, I think that there are different ways. So one is the nutrition argument, as I was talking about earlier,
Bananas.
is
Brown rice.
epistemological pushback in not wanting to be explained why what they were doing was the correct thing, and kind of getting a chop of approval, say, oh yeah, well done, you've been doing the right thing because now we've figured it out. And so it's okay for you to be doing that. So, and that is, to me, that is one way to push back. Another way to push back is specifically breastfeeding, in which especially the women's press in Dutch language, the Dutch language women's press, which of course was not just for ethnic Dutch women, was also for the upper class elite, Javanese and Sumatrans, was obsessed over the need to figure out how to hygienically bottle feed their children. And this is tied into very important conversations that were happening in Europe at the time about resexualizations of women's bodies after the maternal experience. And wanting also, I mean, arguably to regain control over your body. So I think that there are different layers to unpack that, but the bottom line in Europe was you had a child in the early 1900s, you had a child, if you can afford it, you have a wet nurse. If you cannot afford a wet nurse, you will have bottle feeding and possibly have somebody else bottle feed your baby so you can go out shopping. And this is exactly what these women were writing about, regaining control of your body, regaining control of your actions and time. Within the Dutch East Indies and colonial context, wet nurse use was extremely problematic because the Dutch thought, as Anne Stoller in great detail tells us, thought that the pernicious habits of the babu would pass on to the child through the breast milk. And so as a white or Eurasian or, whatever, woman, you wouldn't want to give your child to an indigenous wet nurse. And so bottle feeding becomes this ultimate marker of colonial modernity. And elite, and to me, the important step there is that it's not lower class women who could not afford good lactogen formula, but elite women who could, because they had watches and they had scales. They talk about feeding the child at certain times for a certain amount of time and weighing the baby before and after to figure out how much the baby is actually eaten. And all of this, they talk about putting the baby in a separate room within the house. So we're talking about houses of multiple rooms, not just a shed, right? But they say they draw the line at bottle feed. We say that's not okay. That's not the most nutritious thing. That's not the most hygienic thing. Breastfeeding is better, and the Quran says so, right? And so they push back on that. And then going to the halal food, I think that the way in which it's being pushed back is a colonial discourse of civilizational difference that was pervasive across the colonial messaging, that people who have probably advocated for that civilizational difference were unrest into having to argue that this food that, think about blue band or, yes, specifically blue band, but also magi, had been symbols of the colonial presence in the Dutch East Indies, especially blue band that had emerged as a luxury product for the Dutch to be able to have bread and butter, or condensed milk to have their coffee with milk without being ill from unsanitary milk processing and so on and so forth. Rather have their dairy heavy diet in the tropics. To say, well, it's no longer about this having to be hygienic, untouched by human hands, uncontaminated by the natives, and being nutritious because it has vitamin added thanks to Western technology. But it also needs to be halal because you need us to buy it because your economy is in shambles and you need us as consumers. So I think that there are different ways in which this pushback happens. And so in the colonial context, it's discursive. And that's why I also think it's not so visible and recognized by authorities. But then during the war, it becomes
explicit,
visible, very, very tangible in terms of having women who have done 4 or 5 years of primary education being trained as nurses to run on the battlefield and save soldiers. And yeah, they have an 11-year-old saving a soldier.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for the questions.
And come back soon.
Yes.
Come back with your environmental book.
Yes.
And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.